The porch light flickered like it was unsure whether to stay on. Blue and red reflections slid across the quiet street, washing over a small suburban home where the night had been ordinary just minutes before. Grace Williams stood barefoot on the front steps, wrists burning from cold steel cuffs, her breath shaking in the air. The patrol car door slammed behind her with a sound that felt permanent. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Phones rose. And somewhere down the block, the low, unfamiliar hum of engines approached, slow, deliberate, powerful, like something far bigger than this moment was about to arrive. Before we go any further, I have to ask, where are you watching this from right now?
Listen closely.
It still amazes me how one story can cross cities, borders, even oceans. Drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this moment travels together. Grace hadn't planned on becoming a headline. She was 36, a project manager for a tech security firm, and the kind of woman who kept extra granola bars in her purse, just in case. That evening, she'd been driving home after a 14-hour day when flashing lights filled her rearview mirror. A broken taillight. That was all. The officer had approached slow, hand resting near his belt. Grace rolled down the window, polite, tired, but alert. She answered his questions. She asked why he needed her to step out of the car. Her voice was calm but firm. Too firm, apparently.
Listen
Ma'am,
closely.
don't get an attitude.
Tell anyone about
I don't
this.
have an
It's
attitude,
crucial for the
Grace said.
investigation.
I have a question. That was the pivot. The moment where tone outweighed truth. Words turned sharp. Backup was called. By the time they reached her house, Grace was shaking, not from fear, but from disbelief. On the porch now, one officer filled out paperwork while another avoided her eyes. Grace stared at the chipped paint on her railing, the place where her niece had once taped a crooked paper heart. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, unanswered. "What's the charge?" she asked quietly. "Disorderly conduct. Resisting verbally." She let out a breath that almost laughed. Talking back. That was it. A neighbor, Mrs. Collins, stepped out wrapped in a robe.
Listen closely.
"Grace?
You cannot
Honey,
tell
what's
anyone
going
about
on?"
this. It's crucial
Grace
for
swallowed.
the investigation.
"I don't know." And then the street changed. Not sirens, engines. Deep, synchronized. Black SUVs turned the corner one by one, headlights cutting through the chaos with unsettling calm. They parked with precision, doors opening in near silence. Men and women stepped out, jackets marked with 3 quiet letters, FBI. The officers froze. One of them stammered, Is this related to? A tall woman with a composed face walked toward Grace, eyes scanning the cuffs first, then Grace's face. "Ms. Williams," she said evenly, "I'm Special Agent Ava Moreno. We've been trying to reach you." Grace blinked.
Listen closely.
"I was pulled over."
You cannot tell anyone
Ava
about
nodded,
this. It's
already
crucial
signaling for the cuffs to
investigation.
be removed. "Yes, we see that." Metal clicked open. Blood rushed back into Grace's wrists, but the ache in her chest stayed. The arresting officer stepped back, suddenly small. "You're free to go," Ava continued. "And I'd like to apologize for the timing." Grace looked from the patrol car to the SUVs to her own front door. "Why are you here?" Ava hesitated, just long enough to show the weight of the answer. "Because tomorrow morning, you're scheduled to testify in a federal corruption case. And tonight, credible threats were made against you." Silence swallowed the street. Mrs. Collins gasped. Phones lowered. The officers exchanged
closely.
glances, faces
cannot tell
draining
anyone
of
about
certainty.
this. It's crucial
Grace
for the
sat
investigation.
slowly on her front step, knees weak. All this, because she'd spoken up, because she'd known too much, because she'd refused to stay quiet at work months ago when numbers didn't add up and contracts smelled wrong. Ava crouched beside her. "You did the right thing," she said softly, "even when it cost you comfort." Grace pressed her palms to her eyes. It already did. The night air felt heavier now, charged with things unsaid. And as the FBI agents quietly secured the perimeter, Grace realized this wasn't the end of her fear. It was the beginning of understanding just how much her voice had mattered. And as the street slowly settled back into uneasy calm, Grace stood, stepped inside her home,
Listen closely.
and closed the door behind
cannot
her,
tell anyone
unaware
about
that what
this.
she
It's
just
crucial
endured
for
was
the
only the
investigation.
first crack in a much larger storm still forming. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and old wood, comforting, familiar. Grace leaned her back against the closed door, sliding down until she sat on the floor, knees pulled tight to her chest. Outside, muffled voices moved with quiet authority, shoes brushing gravel, radios whispering codes she didn't understand. Inside, the silence roared. Her phone buzzed again. This time she answered. Grace. Her sister Lily's voice cracked through the speaker. I just saw something on the neighborhood group chat. Are you okay? Grace stared at the faint crack in the ceiling, the one she'd always meant to fix. I'm home,
Listen
she
closely.
said. That's
You
all
cannot
I know
tell
right
anyone
now.
about this. It's
Lily
crucial for
exhaled,
the
shaky.
investigation.
Do you want me there? Yes, Grace whispered before pride could stop her. Please. Minutes later, Agent Ava Moreno knocked, soft, deliberate. Grace opened the door to find Ava holding a folded blanket and a paper cup. Chamomile, Ava said. It's not protocol. It's human. Grace took both with a nod that nearly broke her. The warmth seeped into her hands, grounding her back into her body. If you were there on that porch, watching cuffs come off instead of tightening, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up, or stayed quiet out of fear? Be honest and share your answer below, and if you felt that moment in your chest, tap like to say compassion still counts.
Listen closely.
They sat at the small
cannot
kitchen
tell
table,
anyone about
the one
this.
with
It's
mismatched
crucial for
chairs
the
Grace had
investigation.
collected over years of moving up, then sideways, then barely forward. Ava laid out the truth slowly, carefully, like setting down glass. The company Grace worked for wasn't just bending rules. It was funneling security data to private contractors with political leverage, burying risks under polished reports. Grace had noticed inconsistencies months ago. When she asked questions, doors closed. When she pushed, warnings came. When she refused to sign off on falsified metrics, she became a liability. So you came to us, Ava said. I didn't come, Grace corrected. I was found. Someone leaked my emails. Ava nodded. And now people are nervous. Lily arrived in a rush of cold air and concern, wrapping Grace in a hug that finally released the tears. They came hard and fast, anger mixed with humiliation, relief tangled with dread. I was just talking, Grace sobbed. That's all I did. I know, Lily said. And that's why it matters. The next morning, Grace sat in a nondescript room with beige walls and a flickering fluorescent light. Her hands shook as she held the oath card. Across from her sat men in tailored suits, faces composed, eyes sharp. She spoke anyway. She told the truth. Every late night, every red flag, every email that made her stomach turn. She talked about meetings where silence was rewarded and questions were punished. She talked about being told to play along for the sake of stability. When it was over, she felt hollowed out. But later, days passed. News outlets picked up fragments of the story, never her name at first. Anonymous whistleblower. Federal investigation. Corporate misconduct. Grace stayed inside, curtains half drawn, FBI vehicles rotating shifts outside like sentinels. Then the comments came. Online. Vicious. Speculative. Some guessed her identity. Some blamed her for overreacting. Others called her brave, a hero. The words blurred together until they meant nothing. One afternoon, Grace received a handwritten note slipped through her mail slot. I saw what happened that night. I'm sorry I didn't say anything. Thank you for being braver than I was. No name. Just a small heart drawn at the bottom. Grace pressed the paper to her chest. It wasn't justice. But it was something. Have you ever had someone show up for you? Quietly, unexpectedly, when you needed it most? If yes, write yes, and tell me their name. Gratitude deserves to be spoken out loud. That evening, Ava returned with an update. Charges were coming. Executives were scrambling. But threats hadn't stopped. Change is loud, Ava said. And not everyone likes the noise. Grace looked out the window at the darkening sky. I didn't want to be loud. I know, Ava replied gently. But sometimes truth doesn't whisper. As night settled in, Grace realized the arrest hadn't just exposed the system. It had exposed her. Her fears. Her strength. And the fragile line between the two. She stood alone in her living room, city lights blinking through the glass, wondering how much more this story would take from her, and what it might still give back. The knock on the door came again. Unexpected this time, heavier, more urgent, and Grace felt her heart tighten as she moved toward it, unaware that what waited on the other side would force her to confront a past she thought she'd buried for good. Grace opened the door slowly. Michael Carter stood there, rain darkening the shoulders of his coat, his eyes carrying a mix of regret and urgency that hit her harder than any headline ever could. He hadn't changed much, still tall, still careful with his words, but time had added weight to his posture. The kind that came from knowing you'd once chosen the wrong silence. "Grace," he said quietly, "I'm sorry to show up like this." Her first instinct was to close the door. Her second was to ask why he'd waited so long. Instead, she stepped aside. Michael had been her supervisor 3 years ago. The one who'd warned her, kindly she'd thought, about asking too many questions. The one who'd signed off on reports she knew weren't clean. The one who'd looked away when she needed backup. They sat across from each other in the living room, the space between them filled with years of unsaid truth. "I saw the arrest," Michael began, "and the FBI presence. I knew it was only a matter of time before they connected it back to me." Grace crossed her arms. "You didn't seem worried then." "I was scared," he admitted. "Still am. But seeing you in cuffs, that broke something in me." He pulled a flash drive from his pocket and placed it on the coffee table. "I kept copies. Emails. Internal memos. I told myself it was insurance. Truth is, I didn't have the courage to act." Grace stared at the drive. Anger flared, hot and sharp. "So you let me carry it?" Michael's voice cracked. "Yes. And I hate myself for it." Silence stretched. Outside, thunder rolled low and distant. "Now it's your turn." Pause for a second. "What's one small good thing you've done recently, even when no one noticed?" Share it below. Someone reading might need that reminder tonight that kindness still exists. Grace finally spoke. "Why now?" "Because you were right," Michael said. "And because I don't want to be the man who stayed quiet anymore." She picked up the flash drive. It felt heavier than it was. "This doesn't erase what happened." "I know," he said. "But maybe it helps what comes next." After he left, Grace sat alone again, turning the drive over in her hands. She thought of the night on the porch, of the cuffs, of how easily her dignity had been taken, and how hard it was to get back. The next week unfolded like a slow unraveling. Michael's files corroborated everything Grace had said, and more. Indictments followed. Names fell. The company issued statements that said nothing and meant less. But with truth came backlash. A brick shattered Grace's front window one night. No note. No sound of footsteps afterward. Just glass and fear and the unmistakable message, "We see you." Lily begged her to leave town. Ava increased security. Grace barely slept. In the quiet hours before dawn, memories she'd buried surfaced, her father's voice, calm but firm, telling her when she was 12, "Don't shrink to make others comfortable." He died before she learned how hard that advice could be. One morning, Grace stood in a classroom instead of her living room. Ava had arranged it discreetly. A local university ethics course had asked her to speak, not as a whistleblower, but as a human being who'd faced a choice. The students listened, rapt, as Grace talked about fear. About the cost of speaking up. About the loneliness that followed, and the strange peace that came with it too. A young woman raised her hand. "Would you do it again?" Grace paused. Thought of the porch. The cuffs. The convoy. The broken glass. "Yes," she said softly. "But I wish I'd known I wouldn't be alone." After the talk, a student slipped her a note. "Because of you, I reported something today." Grace held it like a fragile promise. That night, as she returned home under the watchful eye of unmarked cars, Grace felt something shift. The pain was still there. So was the fear. But threaded through it now was purpose. She placed the flash drive and the notes in a drawer, closed it, and finally allowed herself to cry, not from hurt, but from release. The storm outside cleared, leaving the air sharp and clean. Grace stepped onto her porch, the same one where everything had changed, and breathed deeply. She didn't know how this would end, but she knew why it had begun. And as the streetlights hummed back to life, Grace felt ready, because the truth, once spoken, had started to speak back. The media storm arrived quietly at first, an unfamiliar van parked too long across the street, a name whispered on late-night news instead of spoken aloud. Then it grew teeth. Grace's face appeared blurred on screens, her voice distorted in reenactments. Pundits debated her choices like they were chess moves, not human decisions carved from fear and resolve. Some called her brave. Others called her reckless. A few called her a liar. She stopped watching after the third night. Instead, she cleaned the kitchen, the hallway closet, the drawer where old birthday cards still smelled faintly of dust and vanilla. Control came in small rituals now, folding towels, lining up shoes, wiping down surfaces that were already clean. Ava visited less often, but when she did, her presence still grounded the room. "They're pushing for a public hearing," Ava said one evening, setting her folder down. "Your name will be out there. Fully." Grace nodded slowly. She'd known this was coming. Still, the words landed heavy. "And after?" Ava met her eyes. "After, things change. For better or worse." That night, Grace dreamed of the porch again, but this time, there were no cuffs. Just her standing alone, calling out, her voice echoing back unanswered. The hearing took place in a building that smelled like polished wood and old power. Grace wore a navy blazer Lily had picked out, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she waited to be called. When she stood, the room felt impossibly large. She spoke clearly, calmly, about systems that rewarded silence. About how easily authority could mistake compliance for order, and punishment for control. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. When it was over, there was no applause. Just a hum of whispers and the sharp crack of a gavel. Outside, reporters surged forward. Questions collided midair. "Do you regret speaking up? Were you targeted because of your race? Do you feel protected now?" Grace stopped walking, turned, and answered the last one. "No," she said. "But I feel seen." That clip spread everywhere. Messages poured in emails, letters, DMs from strangers who'd watched the arrest, or lived one like it. Stories of being silenced. Of being punished for tone instead of truth. One message stood out. From Mrs. Collins, her neighbor. "I testified today. About what I saw. I should have done it sooner. Thank you for showing me how." Grace sat on the edge of her bed, phone pressed to her chest. Her shoulders shook, not from fear this time, but from the sheer weight of knowing the ripple had reached further than she'd imagined. If that moment just hit you right now, if your chest feels tight in a way you can't explain, leave a red heart below. Sometimes one small symbol says what our hearts don't have words for. The days that followed were quieter. Too quiet. Then, one afternoon, Grace received a call from an unknown number. "This is Internal Affairs," the voice said. "We'd like to speak with you about the arrest." They met in a plain office downtown. No cameras. No audience. The officer who'd handcuffed her sat across the table. Younger than she remembered. Eyes tired. "I followed protocol," he said. "But protocol doesn't always mean right." Grace listened. Said nothing. "I didn't see you," he continued. "I saw a challenge." The admission hung in the air, fragile and incomplete. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said quickly. "I just needed to say it." Grace nodded once. "Then say it to yourself again. Until you believe it." When she left, she didn't feel closure. But she felt something loosen. Weeks later, the charges against the company became official. Executives resigned. Settlements were announced. Policy reforms promised. Grace watched the press conference alone, volume low. It felt distant. Like someone else's life. Lily called. "You did this." "We all did," Grace replied. That night, Grace stood on her porch again. The glass had been replaced. The paint touched up. But she could still see it, the ghost of that first night, the echo of metal on skin. She closed her eyes and breathed. Change hadn't come like a wave. It came like a bruise, slow, painful, undeniable. And as the street settled into its usual quiet, Grace sensed the story wasn't finished yet. Not hers. Not theirs. Something still waited ahead, something that would demand more than courage. It would demand forgiveness. Forgiveness arrived like an uninvited guest. Grace didn't ask for it, didn't reach for it. It showed up anyway, quietly, insistently, in the spaces between breaths. In the moments when anger no longer burned hot, but lingered like ash. It started with a letter. No return address. Plain envelope. Inside, a single page written in uneven handwriting. My name is Daniel Reed. I was the officer who arrested you. I've rewritten this letter 10 times. None of them felt enough. I won't ask you to absolve me. I just need you to know, I'm trying to change. Because of you. Grace read it once. Then again. Her chest tightened, not with rage, but with something more confusing. The kind of pain that comes when accountability finally has a face. She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the others. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Memories looped. The snap of cuffs, the way the neighbors watched, the heat in her face when her voice was labeled a threat. She sat up in bed, knees pulled close, and whispered into the dark, I didn't deserve that. The room didn't argue back. Days later, Ava called with one last request. There's a mediation option, she said carefully. Voluntary. It's part of a pilot program. Officer present. No press. No records beyond a summary. Grace closed her eyes. You think I should go? I think, Ava replied, that whatever you choose, it should be for you. The meeting room was smaller than Grace expected. No uniforms. Just a round table and a box of tissues in the center like an unspoken admission. Daniel Reed sat across from her. Hands clasped. Shoulders tense. I've replayed that night, he said. Over and over. I thought authority meant control. I didn't realize how fragile it actually was. Grace listened. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the weight of being heard at last. He continued, when the FBI showed up, I felt exposed. Not embarrassed. And that scared me more than anything. Silence filled the room. Be honest, after everything you've seen, everything you've felt so far, could you forgive? Type forgive, if you think you could. Or never, if it would cut too deep. Both answers are real. Grace leaned forward slightly. Do you understand, she asked, that you didn't just arrest me, you told me my voice was dangerous? Daniel nodded. Yes. And that message, she said, steady now, has been given to women like me for generations. Another nod. Tears gathered, unhidden. I can't undo it, he said. But I can refuse to repeat it. Grace exhaled slowly. Something shifted, not release, not peace, but space. Enough space to choose what came next. I don't forgive you, she said. Daniel's face fell. Not yet, she added. But I won't carry you as my burden anymore. They left separately. Outside, the sky was wide and painfully blue. Grace stood still, letting the sun warm her face. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't a gift you handed over. It was a door you unlocked, for yourself. Life began to move again. Grace returned to work, not the same company, not the same role. She taught now. Ethics. Transparency. The cost of silence. Her first class was small. Nervous faces. Curious eyes. She started simply. I want to talk about power, she said, and how easily it mistakes obedience for respect. Students leaned in. One afternoon after class, a young man approached her. My sister was arrested last year, he said quietly. For arguing. I didn't know how to help. Grace met his gaze. You're helping now. By not looking away. At home, Lily visited often. Laughter returned in fragments, burnt toast jokes, shared playlists, the comfort of presence without explanation. One evening, Lily asked, do you ever wish it hadn't happened? Grace thought of the porch. The convoy. The notes from strangers. The letter in the drawer. No, she said slowly. But I wish it hadn't taken so much from so many. That night, Grace stepped onto her porch again. The same steps. The same railing. But this time, her hands were free. Her voice steady. She didn't know what the final cost would be. Or the final reward. But she knew this. The hardest part wasn't speaking up. It was deciding what to do with the pain once the world finally listened. And just beyond that realization, something waited. Not justice. Not closure. Hope didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, unfinished, imperfect, but persistent. It showed up on a Tuesday afternoon when Grace received an invitation she almost deleted. A community forum. Local. The kind that rarely made noise. The subject line read, "Voices After Silence." She stared at the screen for a long time before replying yes. The forum was held in a converted church basement, folding chairs arranged in a loose circle. No podium. No cameras. Just people. Some looked angry. Others tired. A few held notebooks like shields. Grace sat quietly at first, listening. A mother spoke about her son being stopped 6 times in 1 year. A teacher described being warned to stay neutral after reporting misconduct. A retired officer admitted he'd followed rules he no longer believed in. When it was Grace's turn, she didn't tell her whole story. She didn't need to. "I used to think courage meant being fearless," she said. "Now I think it means being honest about what scares you, and choosing not to let it decide your values." Heads nodded. Eyes softened. After the forum, a woman named Renee approached her. "We're starting something," she said. "A network. Support for people who speak up. Not lawyers, listeners." Grace felt something bloom in her chest. "I'd like to help." Word spread quietly. Meetings turned into workshops. Workshops turned into policy conversations. Grace found herself in rooms she'd never imagined entering, not as a witness, but as a voice shaping what came next. One evening after a long session, Ava called. "They're rolling out new training," she said. "Bias awareness. De-escalation. It's not perfect, but it's a start." Grace smiled faintly. Starts matter. The officer Daniel emailed once more. No plea. No defense. Just an update. He'd requested reassignment to community outreach. He was studying. Listening. Trying. Grace didn't reply. But she didn't delete it either. If you believe that love can still win, even slowly, even imperfectly, comment below. Let's leave a little hope here for someone who might be scrolling in silence tonight. The anniversary of the arrest came quietly. No news vans. No posts. Just Grace, standing on her porch at dusk, holding a mug of tea. Lily joined her, leaning against the railing. "You okay?" Grace nodded. "I am. I think." They watched the sky deepen into violet. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed. A dog barked. Life continued, stubbornly ordinary. "I used to replay it every night," Grace said. "The cuffs. Thugs. The way my voice sounded to them." "And now?" Lily asked. "Now I remember what came after." Ava stopped by later, no badge visible, just a friend. They sat together, the 3 of them, sharing quiet stories that had nothing to do with investigations. Before leaving, Ava paused. "You changed more than you know." Grace shook her head gently. "We did." Inside, Grace opened the drawer one last time. The letters. The notes. The flash drive. Daniel's apology. She took out the first note, the one with the small heart. Then she closed the drawer and locked it. Some chapters didn't need to stay open. As she turned off the lights and headed to bed, Grace felt something she hadn't in a long time. Peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because she was no longer carrying the weight alone. And as sleep finally found her, a quiet certainty settled in. Her story had become a bridge. And somewhere, someone was already walking across it. The bridge Grace never meant to build began to fill with footsteps. Emails arrived weekly now, sometimes daily, from people who had crossed their own lines of fear after hearing her speak. A nurse who reported unsafe practices. A city clerk who refused to erase records. A teenager who filmed an arrest instead of looking away. Grace read every message slowly, carefully, like each one was a fragile thing entrusted to her hands. Not all of them ended well. Some writers spoke of retaliation, lost jobs, broken friendships. Nights spent wondering if silence would have been easier. Grace answered when she could, not with promises, but with honesty. It hurts, she wrote once. And it might for a while. But you are not wrong. One afternoon, Renee called with urgency in her voice. There's a council vote tomorrow, she said. They're deciding whether to adopt the Civilian Review Board model. Public comments are open. Grace hesitated. She hadn't planned to speak again so soon. Visibility still came with a cost. But she remembered the porch. The cuffs. The way everything changed because she hadn't swallowed her question. I'll be there, she said. The council chamber buzzed with tension. Uniforms on one side. Citizens on the other. The line between them invisible but unmistakable. Grace waited her turn, heart steady but loud. When her name was called, she walked to the podium without notes. I'm not here to accuse, she began. I'm here to remind. She spoke about trust, not as something demanded but earned. About how accountability wasn't an attack on authority, but a commitment to its integrity. About how communities frayed when voices were punished instead of heard. She ended simply. Oversight doesn't weaken systems. It strengthens them by telling the truth out loud. When she stepped back, the room was quiet. Then someone clapped. Then another. The vote passed by a narrow margin. Outside, cameras flashed briefly, but Grace didn't stop. She walked past them, straight into the evening air, lungs full, shoulders light. If you believe love still wins, after pain, after fear, after everything, comment he. Let's flood this moment with hope. Someone out there needs to see it tonight. Weeks later, Grace received an invitation she never expected. A graduation ceremony. One of her former students, the young woman who'd slipped her a note months ago, was speaking. Grace sat in the back row, unnoticed as the student took the stage. I learned this year, the young woman said, voice steady, that ethics aren't theoretical. They're lived. And sometimes they cost you comfort, but they give you something better. Her eyes scanned the crowd, then found Grace. Just for a moment. Grace blinked back tears. Afterward, the student hugged her tightly. You changed my life. Grace shook her head, smiling. You chose your own courage. That night, as Grace drove home, the streetlights blurred softly through her windshield. She thought about the word wins. Love didn't conquer like an army. It outlasted. It stayed when outrage burned out. It rebuilt when attention moved on. At home, she found a small package on her porch. No return address. Inside was a framed photo. Her porch. Not the night of the arrest, but weeks later. Grace stood there laughing, Lily beside her, Ava mid-sentence. The house lit warm behind them. A note was taped to the back. I wanted to remember it this way. Thank you for letting us see you whole. Mrs. Collins. Grace held the frame close. The past no longer felt like a wound, it felt like a scar. Evidence of healing. The world didn't suddenly become just. People were still stopped. Voices still dismissed. Power still misused. But now there were cracks. And through them lit. Grace placed the photo on her mantle, turned off the lights, and stood for a moment in the quiet, feeling the steady hum of a life reclaimed. She knew the story was nearing its end, not because everything was resolved, but because something essential had shifted. The pain had been carried. The truth had been spoken. And hope, quiet, stubborn hope, had taken root. All that remained now was to decide what this story would leave behind. The morning arrived without ceremony. No sirens. No cameras. Just soft sunlight slipping through the blinds, resting on the edges of Grace's living room like it belonged there. She moved slowly, deliberately, making coffee she didn't rush, standing at the window a little longer than necessary. For the first time since that night, her body felt quiet. Grace dressed simply and stepped outside. The porch creaked under her feet, familiar and honest. She placed her hand on the railing, tracing the grain of the wood where fear had once anchored her in place. Now it felt like grounding, not restraint. A young woman stood across the street, hesitating. Early 20s. Backpack slung over one shoulder. Nervous eyes. Grace? She asked. Grace nodded. That's me. I'm sorry to bother you, the woman said quickly. My name's Ava, different Ava. I came to one of the workshops. I wanted to say thank you before I moved. They sat on the steps together. I was going to stay quiet, the young woman admitted, about something wrong at my job. I told myself it wasn't my place. But then I heard your story. And I thought, if she could survive that, maybe I could survive telling the truth. Grace listened, eyes soft. I don't know what'll happen, Ava said. But I'm not afraid anymore. When she left, Grace stayed seated for a long time. This was the ending no one filmed. No headlines. No applause. Just one person choosing courage because another had gone first. Lily called later. Lunch. Soon, Grace said. I'm just taking it in. Ava Moreno texted a photo not long after, her in plain clothes, smiling with a coffee in hand. Retirement looks good on me, the caption read. Grace smiled. In the afternoon, she received one final email. Direct. They approved the national rollout of the review board model. You were cited in the proposal. Renee. Grace closed her laptop gently. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt grateful. Before the sun dipped low, she stood once more on the porch, watching the neighborhood settle into evening routines. Porch lights clicked on. Doors opened. Lives unfolded. If this story moved you, even quietly, please don't scroll past in silence. Tap like, not for me, but for the woman who stood in cuffs and still chose dignity. One small click can say, I saw you. I felt this. Grace thought back to the question that started everything. Why did you talk back? Because silence had never protected her. Because dignity wasn't negotiable. Because someone had to be the first voice in the room. She understood now that pain doesn't disappear when justice arrives. It transforms. It becomes wisdom. It becomes boundaries. It becomes the strength to stand on a porch that once held fear, and claim it as your own. Grace stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. The world outside still wasn't perfect, but it was listening a little more closely. And sometimes, that's enough to begin.